Well, good day, everybody. Welcome to the Lifetime Training Podcast. And honestly, this is the episode that I've been working since before we even started it. This book and this author has changed my life, honestly. And when I hit rock bottom at one point, if I didn't find this book, I don't know where I've been, and the concepts more specifically within it. And today we're going to bring you author, philosopher, entrepreneur, Nate Klemp, who holds a BA and a master's of philosophy from Stanford and a PhD from Princeton. Him and his wife, Kaley, authored a brand new book called The 80-80 Marriage, a new model for happier, stronger marriage. He's also the co-writer of, again, one of my favorite books called Start Here, Mastering the Lifelong Art of Wellbeing. And recently merged his company, LifeXT, with Mindful. And we are going to talk today about something that is so needed in the world, and that is happiness and truly the skill of developing happiness. So thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the show, Nate.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me, Jason. I'm glad we finally got to do this. Very excited. Yeah. We had all sorts of obstacles in the way, but we are here now.
That's it. I had to keep that persistent button going. So, I think a great place to start, Nate, is obviously well-being. Some people understand what it is. Some people don't. I would love for you to just go into kind of your definition of what this is and why it's so needed in the world today.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think when I was starting out in my career, I thought of well-being as a primarily physical state, which may resonate with a lot of your listeners. So, I was a track and cross country runner. I was always very physically active. I was always an athlete. And I thought of well-being as basically my level of fitness. And then as I encountered some really challenging obstacles, particularly at the end of graduate school when I was finishing up my PhD, I had a very bad bike accident coupled with all sorts of things going on in my life. I started to realize that there's this other dimension of well-being around our mind, around our emotions and our mental states that's just as, if not more important, and also totally interconnected with our physical well-being. So the way I would define well-being now is that it's really that combination both of physical health, but also mental health, emotional health. And, just as you can be physically fit, one of the big ideas of LifeXT and our book Start Here is that you can increase your mental fitness and your emotional fitness. And that's not the way we generally think about those things, but I think it's actually a really important and interesting concept.
It is. And I love, just the basic definition of it being a state of being comfortable, healthy, and happy, and that obviously is what we're going to dive into. But, I would love to start too, again, diving into, just an overview. I mean, obviously I highly recommend go get this book, read it twice, 4 times, 10 times, highlight it. Mine's all right here. And I could tell you, it's got all kinds of stuff all over it. So, but if you wouldn't mind just doing an overview of the LifeXT process and, the train, be, do concept.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we wrote this book. We started writing it about 9 years ago. And the basic idea is we wanted to bring together the best of modern neuroscience, because there are all these amazing discoveries in neuroscience and positive psychology with my background, which is philosophy and ancient wisdom. But we also wanted to do that in an extremely practical way. So we wanted this to be accessible and actionable so that, it really resulted in some very simple habits you could weave into your everyday life. And so at the time, 9 years ago, P90X was a huge thing, which I know you were very familiar with. Maybe it still is a big thing. I haven't heard about it much.
They've changed the name. They remarketed it,
Okay, so now it's got some name. Yeah. But at the time, P90X was this really interesting innovation, which is basically, it was based on this idea of cross-training and muscle confusion and bringing together a number of different interconnected exercises. And as we were thinking about this book, we realized, again, just as you can cross-train in physical fitness, that the same is true when it comes to your mental and emotional fitness. And that, in fact, there is no one practice or exercise. A lot of people talk about meditation, and I'm a a meditator for many years, and we talk about meditation in the book. But meditation is just one of a number of different practices. For some people, it doesn't resonate. For others, it does.
Yep.
So what we wanted to do in the book is say, hey, we are looking at this from a holistic perspective, and we're all about cross-training your mind, which I know sounds crazy, but the way we do that in the book is we lay out 9 different practices, all validated by science and ancient wisdom. They give you interconnected tools for training every part of your mind and emotional being, as it were.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, as you mentioned, there's sort of 3 stages in the book. We talk about train, which are kind of like the fundamental practices you might want to do every day. B, which are practices that open you up to a state of being more present, more available to your life, more aware of what's happening in your life. And then doing being really, how do you integrate these practices into the midst of your everyday life so that it is a lived and embodied practice, and that it's really in the end about contributing something of value to your family and to the world.
Yep. And, I've talked about it, and the listening base is kind of the spectrum, but it's a predominant trainer, fitness enthusiast base. And I know those that follow the show often hear me say that this evolution of what I'll call the health and fitness professional, when I got certified, went through school and then got certified in, early 90s, we were bodybuilders, and that's what it was. And then, physical therapists started to come in, and we started tapping into what we call corrective exercise, because, we can't do physical therapy. And then nutrition started to become more, because early on you couldn't touch nutrition. And now it's the mental health. And my point in carrying that spectrum is truly the people that want to get out there and help the majority of the people, especially the majority of the people that need it the most. It's this type of thing. You can't be a sets and reps exercise guy, and I always say the best workout doesn't mean anything if you can't get them to do it. And I think some of the steps that we'll talk about in understanding what the mind is going through is a huge skill for all of us to learn, but more importantly, for those that are trying to help others to learn as well.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And, I've experienced that as well, that you think about something like weightlifting or running, and we think about it in this purely physical way. Yep. But if your job is to get somebody to run, your job isn't just about like teaching them how to run. They already know how to run. Your job in some ways is about how do you unwind some of the mental roadblocks and barriers that person is throwing up in the way, the resistance that they might have, and that all of a sudden takes you out of, the perfect form when you're running, or what your workout's going to look like on the track, or how much you're going to bench press. And it takes you into this whole other domain of, what does resistance look like in the mind? How do we meet it as a friend instead of resisting and pushing it away? All sorts of other stuff that's really in the terrain of that mental and emotional well-being space.
Perfect. And that's a great segue into, I think us first starting talking about the happiness set point in that concept. And I always say that, most of the people in our world understand that we kind of have a weight set point, right? We diet and we gain weight, we lose weight, but we always come back to about that. And as we age, that thing unfortunately moves up, right? But we have that set point, and I think you understand that. Well, this is the set point as it relates to happiness. So would you mind diving into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So what researchers in positive psychology have found is that almost everybody has a unique happiness set point, which is essentially your home base on this spectrum of well-being. And what's really interesting about this is they've done research on people who have extremely good things that happen in their life and people who have extremely bad things happen. So they've looked at lottery winners, and they start out at a certain level of happiness. They win the lottery. For 2 to 3 months, their level of happiness skyrockets and they feel amazing. But then all of a sudden, it comes right back to this same set point. The reality of it sets in. There's a concept called the hedonic treadmill, which is this idea that if you get a new house or you buy a new car, again, for 2 to 3 months, it's novel and it's new and you feel great about it. But then it just becomes habitual and routine, and you come right back to that level of happiness. And same is true with people who lose a spouse or have something really traumatic happen. Often their level of happiness will go down, but then it kind of comes back to this set point. And so the really interesting thing about this is that, first of all, we have this set point, and researchers used to think that this was totally fixed, that once we got to adulthood, there's really nothing we could do to alter our level of happiness, that the brain in many ways was just fixed. And as you know, and I'm sure your listeners know, all sorts of interesting neuroscience research over the last 20 years has begun to show that that's actually not true, that the brain, it's not like plaster, it's more like plastic, even the adult brain. And so this is where practices like mindfulness and meditation and inquiry and all these things that we talk about in the book become really exciting, because what they're essentially designed to do is to begin to shift some of those habits in the mind to allow you to shift that happiness set point toward a more optimal place.
Awesome. And so, and again, in the book, it goes into depth, but I'd love to break it down. I kind of call it there's the four personalities of the mind is kind of how I've kind of coined it, right? Or in my mind is, you've got the negativity bias, and it really, that's kind of the strongest thing. And what was so powerful for me too, and I think for listeners, and is it's that built-in feature, and I'll let you go into it, but it almost allowed me to understand, and I don't want to take it into religion, but it almost allowed me to kind of understand a little bit of, the concept of, whether, and I don't want to get into religious beliefs right now, but the devil and the good and the bad and how we remember those things. But it helped me make sense of stuff. And I'm like, man, if I was a kid and it was taught to me that way, I think I would understand things a lot better. I would understand why I have these negative thoughts in my mind, and that's normal.
I mean, that's really important. So what you were talking about there, the negativity bias, this is something that, again, they've begun to see as a pattern of basic human existence, that we tend to focus on the negative. We tend to look for threats in our environment. We live with this anxiety bias, you might say. And it makes sense because, evolutionarily speaking, that's a really good adaptive skill. If you're living on the savannah, it's much more important to know that there's a snake behind that rock and have a bit of anxiety than it is to feel grateful all the time and, to be looking up at the sky and thinking how great your life is. So it makes sense why we have it. And I think just that recognition that it's there, and that is in some ways the default state of the brain, can be really helpful. Because I know for me, I've been practicing these tools, meditation now for, I don't even know how long, 12, 13, 14, 15 years, something like that. And I still wake up in the morning many days and I'm flooded with these negative thoughts. And so I've learned, I guess, if I've learned one thing, it's that you can't get rid of those thoughts, but you can change the way you relate to them. You can have a more friendly spirit in your own mind. And that itself is really the big change and the big shift in some ways.
Yeah. And I love the quote that you have in the book is, we're running complex software on prehistoric hardware. Would you dive into that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, I think in some ways that's the modern predicament, that we are really wired for a prehistoric environment. Our brain has not changed all that much in terms of the way that the brain functions over the last 10,000 years. And yet, if you think about the modern problems that we are faced with and the smartphones that we're walking around with that are constantly calling out for our attention and the amount of information that's coming at us every day, it's a really unprecedented situation. And so that's the basic idea, is that we have the hardware that's running our brain and our mind in some ways isn't really built for our modern condition. So as a result, I think it's all the more important for us to train some of these skills that allow us to be more adaptive to this modern context, where many of us have a neural addiction to our devices. We're also experiencing all the ordinary difficulties of being a human being, health problems, chaos in the world, tragedies, our own insecurities. So we're really up against a lot. And so I think it makes sense to invest in some of these practices that can allow you to be more skillful.
Yeah. Awesome. So, again, then diving into the set point, which the negativity bias has an impact, obviously the awareness of it, and dealing with it is part of that. But then, you have the 3 set point forces, like the forces that are really impacting that. Would you mind diving into those?
Yeah, boy, this is funny. I wrote this book, or I co-wrote this book 4 or 5 years ago. And I'm not sure I can remember all of those. I believe it's negativity bias. It's running these simulations about sort of future events, time traveling in the mind.
Judgment.
And then judgment.
Yeah, judgment, attachment, and resistance.
So look at this, Jason. You know my book better than I do. I feel embarrassed, but also totally humbled and grateful.
Well, yeah. And so, it's just, again, I thought that those were so powerful totally. And again, I want to tie in the meditation thing in here because so many people out there, I did it in the beginning. I know my wife is kind of that way where she's like, I can't get my brain to stop thinking. I'm like, yeah, that's the point, but you're aware of it, So, this concept of how we judge ourselves constantly, is that something you could dive into?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, as you said, one of the biggest obstacles to starting a mindfulness or a meditation practice is judgment. And the judgments come from everywhere. So as you mentioned, one of the big judgments that many people have when they start a mindfulness practice is, I'm not doing it right. I'm not focused enough. My mind is just too scattered to be doing this. Or the primary one, which you talked about, I can't stop thinking, so I must be doing it wrong. And these judgments get in the way, and they're also just not true. The idea that somehow has gotten out there about meditation, that you can, through this practice, completely quiet your mind and turn your mind into this peaceful, like nature reserve where there's no thoughts and it's all just sunshine and rainbows, is just totally ridiculous. Nobody has ever been able to do it, as far as I can tell. And even the most experienced meditators still report that their mind is flooded with thoughts. So that's not really the goal. The goal is, however, to change the way the mind is sort of automatically judging everything, and see if you can get to a place which in the mindfulness tradition is called non-judgmental awareness, of basically just beginning to see things in the mind arise and pass away. So you see certain emotions, fear, anxiety, you see those emotions arise and you watch them pass away. You watch certain thoughts come up and pass away. And instead of thinking like, oh no, not that thought, I hate that thought, or ooh, I love that thought's amazing, to just start to watch them come and go and become more familiar with the dynamics of the mind and how all of that works, and to see that everything is somewhat impermanent in the mind, that nothing really stays. It's always changing, because we have this tendency, especially when we're judging, to say, oh, that emotion's bad. That's the judgment. But then also to imbue that emotion that we're feeling in the moment with this experience of permanence, to think, I'm going to feel this anxious for the rest of my life. This will never go away. Or I'm going to feel this pain in my neck for the rest of eternity. That's just what the mind does.
And that's almost going into the attachment side of it too, right? So staying attached to, what is happening to me now. And again, like you've said in the book, or it's, we live in an impermanent world. Unfortunately, we're all going to die, at the extreme case. But that attachment to things, and we can see it now more than ever in people's attachments to things. So
you're attached to pleasurable things, you're resisting the painful things, you're judging everything as good and bad, where, the good things are good and the bad things are bad. And it does really set up this problematic dynamic in the mind.
Yeah. And then the third guy, I always say, the resistance, which you've mentioned, we have to spend time there because, that's, I call it the mother of all evil, right? Is that resistance. Would you mind going into, some people might not be familiar with the concept of mental resistance?
Yeah. Well, resistance is something we have all experienced. I would say we probably all experience this every day, many times. And it's just this subtle turning away that we do in our mind toward things that make us feel uncomfortable. So this could be events in the world. This could be difficult conversations. This could be painful emotions. This could be sensations we don't like, right? It really spans the whole gamut of the human experience. But what's really interesting about resistance, I'm sure you've heard the adage, what you resist persists.
Yeah.
And there's actually a lot of truth to that, that the more we try to run away from these things that make us feel uncomfortable, the more we essentially empower them and the more energy they take on, the more suffering they cause us. So one of the big ideas in the mindfulness tradition is, can we train our attention and our mind so that when resistance shows up, we stay cool and we stay present? And that sounds so easy, but if you take something like fear, to just sit there and be with it and be present with the experience of fear and notice the sensations happening in your body and see if you can actually open your mind and your body to that experience of fear. That's so different than what we usually do, which is we contract our muscles, or we work harder, we dive into the smartphone. We have all these really clever things we've all developed, ways that we can run away, essentially.
Yeah. And it was funny because before I read your book, I was introduced to a book called The War of Art, not The Art of War, The War of Art, by a guy named Stephen Pressfield. And he talks a lot about that. Yeah. And he calls the resistance the BS your mind tells you to not do what you really need to do. Because if you think about fear and all the fears that we have when it relates to things that we really need to do, whether it's, getting up to go to do that workout, how does our mind tell us all these things of why not to do it? And becoming aware of that is so powerful.
And the only thing I would just say, there's one difference between the way I think about this and that book, The War of Art, which is there's a subtle way in which Pressfield sets up resistance as the enemy. Yeah. He actually says it straight up. We're at war with the enemy. And the enemy is resistance. Yeah. And that can work for some people. But for many people, that can actually embolden the resistance and energize the resistance. And so there's an alternative approach, which I would recommend experimenting with, where the goal is really to become friends with the resistance, which is very different, to turn toward the resistance, to open to it, to understand it. And then often it just kind of fizzles away. Yeah. So it's a different approach that,
for sure. Yeah. And at the end of it, I think it's the awareness, right? It's the ability to become aware of those things so that you could then figure out strategies on how to move forward. And, and I think, in the book, and, you've got in the do stage, there's the meditation. This is why I love it. It includes meditation as, that's the first step. You got to be able to become aware of some of the stuff. Then the second one is obviously movement, which, I don't want to spend a ton of time there. Obviously that's what we do. Yeah, we're good there. But then there's the inquiry aspect, which again, I thought, there was two skills, among many, but the two that really stood out to me within the book was the inquiry method and in kind of using Brian Cady's work. And then also the notice, shift, rewire concept, which comes a little bit later in the book. Yeah. So would you mind spending, again, what is inquiry and why is that kind of the third leg of the do stage?
Yeah, well, inquiry is one of my favorite practices. And it's a practice that's so interesting because it runs throughout history. You can find this in ancient philosophy and all sorts of spiritual traditions. You can also find it in cognitive behavioral therapy, so modern psychology. And the basic idea, I think it was put best by Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher. He said, we're not bothered so much by what happens, but by our thoughts about what happens.
Powerful.
And I think that's such a big idea. Byron Katie has a similar quote where she says, the world is a mirror reflection of our mind. So basically what they're both getting at is that we think that if we could just change everything that's happening outside of us, out there, our partner, our neighbor, our coworkers, the world, politicians, right? Whatever, like that's the key to happiness. If we could just change all those people, and if the world could just run the way we think it should be run, and we could control everything, the entire flow of events in the world, then we could finally be happy. And of course, the problem with that strategy is that we can't control those events. So we're constantly disappointed, and we're constantly pissed off and feeling irritated or afraid. And so where inquiry comes in is it says, there's actually a better technology for shifting your experience that starts in your own mind. And that if you can start to change the way you perceive the world and the thoughts and beliefs that you hold that shape that perception, all of a sudden your mind changes, but so does the world, or at least your perception of it. And so the techniques there are a lot of different ones, but one of the ones we talk about in the book is this idea of inquiry that Byron Katie developed, where you're essentially just questioning the validity of the stories and beliefs that cause you stress. So if I believe I'm not good enough, or I believe there's something wrong with me, that belief causes tremendous suffering, and it shows up everywhere in my life. But if I can begin to question that and really start to unwind that belief, then there's so much freedom that can come in my life, and so much more joy that was unavailable to me. So it's a really powerful practice and a powerful idea, I think.
Yep. And I think too, to bring it back to the meditation, I think that's what you come to realize, or again, through my experience of it. And I ended up using, several different apps to help me through the guided meditations. And I believe you've got some of that stuff that we want to get into on the mindful side of it. But, it was just after probably about 40, 50 hours of doing it, where again, I just started to see things differently. I started to see that thing that used to anger me, and it just doesn't anymore. And, it's just, and my point being here is some people just get so frustrated with the whole meditation part, but just stick with it. Just become aware and know that that's what it's all about. So, man, that's great. Well, obviously, so this book's written, and there's a heck of a lot more in the book, but I think that's, where I wanted to kind of dive into, and I think is so impactful for people to understand, especially those that want to live a happier life, is understanding these things that we're up against, and then figuring out how to go about doing that or moving forward. But obviously some similarities between some of the concepts there, and then why and how did you come to write the 80-80 marriage with your wife? And then I'd love to dive into that.
Yeah, well, so the 80-80 marriage came about several years ago. And essentially, my wife and I, we were both professionals. We were trying to solve a problem that we think all modern couples face at some point, which is how can you be equals and in love? And we thought there has to be a book on that. But we looked at a lot of the marriage books, and there's some great marriage books out there, but they're primarily on how to communicate better, how to listen to each other, how to express your love language or know your love language of your spouse. They weren't really looking at this unique modern context where we're not living in the 1950s anymore, where roles were really clear and you knew who was washing the dishes and who was going to work. All of a sudden, all of that's out the window. We're all equally capable of being rock stars in our day job. We're all equally capable of changing a diaper. So as a result, what we experienced in our life was a lot of chaos and confusion. And we experienced this in talking to a lot of friends. And then we ended up interviewing about 100 people about their relationships for this book. And we found that there is this experience of just total confusion and really a lack of a model for how to run a modern marriage.
Yeah. And what's funny too, and I did not read, the book. I was skimming through pieces of it before this podcast, but the story right out the bat, which I can totally relate to. And I've got 3 kids. So it's not only take one pair of shoes and just flip them off, but multiple pairs of shoes right when you walk in. And, would you mind telling that story of kind of how some of that came about? And because I think it's great and super relatable.
Yeah. Well, we talk at the beginning of the book about how the beginning of our relationship was really defined by this battle over what is or isn't fair. Trying to achieve 50-50. So one example is I used to leave my shoes in front of the front door, And finally, this is when Kaley and I first moved in together 17 years ago. Finally, she just took my shoes, hid them, and I had to find them, right? And I was really upset about it. But then, it escalated to things like trying to find the fair balance of time between our extended families. What's fair when we go back to Colorado, where both of our families lived? How do we split that time evenly? And we'd fight about the exact balance of that time and when we left my parents' house for her parents' house. Yeah. And so we saw in our own life, but again, in the lives of so many modern couples, that along with this amazing innovation of equality in marriage, which is great, comes this paradox of how do you achieve equality? And like the clumsy technology that we fell into and most people fall into is this idea of, well, if we just make everything perfectly fair, 50-50, and we keep score to validate that it is fair, then somehow we're going to achieve this lasting state of marital bliss and we're going to ride off into the sunset happily ever after. And that's just like, it was total delusion, at least for us. And we found that no couple actually achieved that. Mm-hmm. So the book is really about how can we find a better model that allows us to be equals, but also doesn't take away the connection and the intimacy that we experience when we're really, in love with each other and connected with each other.
That's powerful. So the 80-80 kind of, if you want to call it a fraction or whatnot, can you go into that and kind of how you came up with that and what that actually means?
Yeah. So really 80-80 is viewed against this backdrop of 50-50 fairness, where we're sort of playing tug of war and we're each pulling on our respective side, trying to keep everything 50-50. The idea is that if we drop the rope and we go well beyond 50%, in the book we call it 80%, but that's arbitrary. You may never get to 80%. It doesn't really matter. The basic idea is you're shifting from a mindset of fairness, where you're almost at odds with your partner, to a mindset of radical generosity, where the goal is to contribute more than your fair share. And when that happens, and there's two really amazing things that happen. One, it can really unwind a lot of your own resentment and irritation. If you're doing the dishes and you feel like, it's not my turn, this is the third night in a row, you're bathing yourself in stress and cortisol. If you can shift to a perspective of, I'm doing this as a gift to my partner or to my family, all of a sudden you've just changed your experience. So that's a good thing. But then the other peculiar thing we noticed through all these interviews is that radical generosity is contagious. That if just one person can shift to this mindset and do something radically generous or appreciate their spouse, all of a sudden it creates this upward spiral where your spouse is more likely to do the same. And it can change the entire underlying culture of your marriage.
Got it. It kind of, I often wonder in my mind going, okay, does it get into kids, dealing with kids? And how do we do that and shift that down, that same concept to kids as well? Could be another book.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because we actually have noticed that the contagiousness does go down to children as well.
Sure.
So about 2 months ago, we had this huge interview where we were going to be on Good Morning America on Monday, and it was Sunday night, and I completely blew the practice. I was super stressed out. Kaley could see it. So she put a sticky note on my bedside table just saying, hey, good luck tomorrow. And I wrote her a note the next day, similar, hey, thank you for that. Our daughter picked up on this. She started writing us little sticky notes all over the house. And it was just really cool to see that this wasn't just contagious between the two of us. Like it actually does transmit to children and probably beyond that as well.
That's powerful. Super powerful.
Yeah.
So, to get into mindful now, I know that is a fairly new venture, right? And would you mind going into what that is all about and what you can get, from, exact, and I'll have everything in the show notes as well on all the links and everything like that as well.
Yeah. So I started a company along with Eric Langshur called Life Cross Training, Life XT, based on Start Here. We've been talking about all the principles of that. Once we wrote the book, we started doing a lot of corporate training work where we bring this work into organizations through coaching. And then about 6 months ago, we merged that company that focuses on corporate training with Mindful, which is a media organization. They have a magazine called Mindful. Mindful.org is also an online resource with a lot of articles and resources. So now we're one and the same, and we continue to do the coaching work in corporations with life cross training. And then on the mindful side, there's all sorts of cool things going on. So we have online courses that teach you about various aspects of meditation. I actually have a course I'm doing that's just finishing up. So it's going to be out in a couple months, which I think is going to be really exciting. But also for people who are really new to mindfulness, it's a great place to go because there's all sorts of great articles on how to start a meditation practice. There's a lot of guided audio tracks that allow you to have a teacher guiding you through meditation, which is helpful at the beginning.
Got it.
So yeah, it's a great resource and really fun for me to be a part of this bigger thing.
That's awesome. And, one thing that popped up too, because I know that, from what I've read, you're an avid, yoga practitioner as well.
Yeah.
And, I think sometimes people who, maybe aren't looking at, they equate yoga to meditation and meditation to yoga.
Yeah.
And, would you mind diving into, for some of those people that might fear one or the other, and they are separate, that they combine, obviously, but can you go into that a bit?
Yeah. Well, in my own personal life and my own personal practice, yoga and meditation are my two go-to things that I do. So every morning I wake up, I do somewhere between an hour to an hour and 15 minutes of yoga. And then every day I'll meditate for about 30 minutes. That's about the average. And the two practices are very similar and complementary, but yoga I think of as a practice it's more physically based. It's more about opening the mind through opening the body. So that's why we're moving into all these various postures, and we're opening up certain blockages in the body. And the idea is that our mind and our consciousness really is embodied. So when we have things that are shut down in our body, that's going to show up in the mind. But the body is the vehicle for that. And the breath, instead of just watching the breath in its natural state, we're sort of consciously moving the breath into various parts of the body and consciously using the breath in various ways to create different reactions in our nervous system. Yeah. So meditation, on the other hand, is really just about creating a different experience of our own mental states. And so there's generally no movement, right? You're seated, but there's also not an effort to create a particular kind of state. So we're not trying to relax, which often, in certain parts of yoga, we're doing that. Instead, we're just watching the mind as it is. We're watching life as it is. And so if anxiety comes up, we don't say, oh, now I need to relax. I'm going to go do some yoga. No, it's more bringing this attitude of exploration and interest to everything that arises. So anxiety arises. Interesting. Can I be friends with that anxiety? Can I watch the anxiety? What are the sensations around it? Right? Like it's a very different style of practice, but in the end, they're really complementary, I think.
Yeah. And so, obviously a good portion of the listeners are health and fitness professionals, and, you've got the Life XT program. Is there things that they can go and learn to take that concept, and, are there coaches, or is there a pathway to further education as an instructor outside of just maybe say reading Start Here?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think Start Here is a really great place for fitness professionals to start because, as I mentioned at the beginning, we framed this all around the metaphor of fitness and the idea of cross-training. So I think as an on-ramp, that will be really compelling to a lot of people who are listening to this.
Yep.
But then if you want to go further, we do offer coaching through Life XT. So we have Life XT certified coaches. They mostly work in corporations, but if people are interested in doing a one-on-one individual session or set of sessions with our coaches, that's certainly something they could do.
Got it.
And then I would also just say, beyond our book, there are all sorts of things we point to in the book where you can go deeper. So for example, if you love that inquiry practice, Byron Katie's work is something you should check out, and you can go way deep into that. Yeah. If you love a certain style of meditation, we give you the resources in the book that will lead you to the best other books and other resources there.
Yeah. And I think for those out there, the power in this, in being able to utilize these tools, is you're no longer just offering a movement experience. And as you've got in the book, there's meditation, movement, and inquiry in that first session. And I think as a trainer, I know in people that I've worked with, is that you're overcoming the biggest reasons why people leave you. It's the resistance, it's the attachment, it's the judgment. I'm not getting the result. And by adding in the awareness and adding in these concepts to what you're doing, you're going to find that your people are going to break through and stick with you longer, because a lot of times they drop right before they're really going to get the result, right? Like we always do. It's the 3 feet from gold concept. So again, I can't emphasize the power of this stuff. Well,
and I just want to say one thing on that.
Yeah.
I think mindfulness can be so powerful when it comes to something like fitness, because I think many of us got into fitness with this mentality of no pain, no gain. I'm just going to crush it. I'm going to push myself to the absolute max. And especially as we get older, I'm 41 now, that ethos of exercise does not work for me anymore. That's a recipe for me to get hurt and never exercise again. And so mindfulness is really powerful as a way to really bring our attention into these physical activities, so that we're staying on the skillful edge. Obviously we want to push ourselves. We want to do things that are beyond our current edge, but we also want to be mindful of not going too far. And so that attention and that present moment awareness can be a really powerful tool and can actually save you from injury and a lot of problems down the road.
I should have listened to my side. Last week, I decided to, after not playing in 7 years, get into a basketball league and a softball league on the same night. Yeah, it didn't go well. Did not go.
Imagine.
So, but again, the piggyback is, for those out here, the population that you work, that the majority of health and fitness professionals are working with, the 35 to 60 plus, the well-being, I'm okay with a 4-pack or maybe even a 2-pack, but I just don't want to hurt anymore. Like these are the things that I think, and I highly strongly recommend you start to dive into, Nate's work, Byron's work, like to be able to help people feel better. And that's the longevity of the client that you're going to have, the referrals that you're going to get, and you're just going to be a more successful professional. And that is just a bigger demographic of person. So I can't overemphasize that enough either.
Yeah.
Well,
thank you.
No, man, I really appreciate it. Is there anything else you have coming down the pipeline, or anything else that you want to add to, kind of the conversation that we've had so far today?
Well, I would just say that LifeXT, you can find out more about that on the Mindful website, mindful.org. Start here. We've talked a lot about 80/80 marriage. If you're interested in that, we have a website, 8080marriage.com. And I guess the main thing that I would say is, if this is new to you and you've never done this, it's worth at least giving it a try and just seeing what happens, because, it turns out that if you look at all these amazing athletes, people at the very top of the game, LeBron James, et cetera, yes, they have this amazing physical practice and this physical dimension to what they do, but they're also training their minds, and realize that in some ways doing both is the key to being at the very top of peak performance. So I think there's a good argument for doing both of these practices, creating fitness in your body, but also creating fitness in your minds and your emotions. And if you can do all of those things and sort of become fit on all dimensions, in some ways, I think that's a really exciting place to be.
Well, and I would argue too, I saw it going from high school sports to collegiate basketball. And I always say, if you're getting to that point in your, let's call it sophomore, junior season in high school, where your skill's there to be able to go to the next level, I argue you got to keep working on the skill, But the skill that's more important is the skill between your head and
Totally.
being able to deal with coaching and be able to deal with, just all the mental pieces. And I'd argue the people who are at an elite level, they're all doing it. They're all doing some form of mental practice and mental coaching. But Nate, again, it has been an absolute pleasure. I could speak to you all day long. And I really, really hope to maybe get you on again and continue to help push your information out to the health and fitness world, because I think it is sorely needed.
Well, thank you, Jason. So good to be here.
Likewise, man. Have a great day.